You guys should buy the M1 MacBook Air, now in 2023, going into 2024. For the money, I consider it the best MacBook you can buy, and here's why. So we're gonna start with the performance. So these came out with the M1 chip in 2020. The M1 chips were groundbreaking and a huge step forward. So the chip is now 3 years old, and it may seem dated to some of you, but for the average person, it's still an amazing chip. It may be 3 years old, but this thing is still overkill for most people. Some of you watching may be using phones and laptops that are 5 to 10 years old, so going to something like this would be such a huge jump for you guys. This thing is more than enough for teachers and students, and if you wanted to get into video and photo editing, this thing can still handle it too. Once you start getting into more complicated video editing like I do, then that's when you might need to upgrade. So if you do want to get into photo and video editing, the M1 MacBook Air is a good place to start. In fact, I wish I had something like this when I started YouTube 6 years ago. But besides that, it handles everything else pretty smoothly. You can take notes, watch videos, have multiple tabs open, and it easily handles it. Before I move on, if you guys can like the video and consider subscribing. It really does help the channel out and I appreciate it. So now we're gonna go to the design. This is the last MacBook Air that has the classic wedge design. So from the front it looks very thin, and because of how thin it is, it can fit into almost any bag. And at 2.8 pounds, it's still lightweight. It's definitely lighter than my 14-inch MacBook Pro that I have behind me, and it's much thinner too. One thing you should know about this MacBook is that it doesn't have a fan. If you have an older MacBook, it most likely gets hot really easily. The fans on my old MacBook Pro from years ago were always running too, so you might be concerned that this doesn't have a fan. But because of how good the new chips are, a fan is not needed. Even on my 14-inch MacBook Pro, I almost never hear the fans. 95% of the time, it runs silent. I only hear the fans when I'm doing very heavy video editing, so not having a fan in the MacBook Air is not an issue. So now we're gonna move on to the battery life, and that was a major improvement when these M1 chips came out. Apple claims up to 15 hours being on the internet, and up to 18 hours if you're watching movies on Apple TV. And that's a better battery life than my 14-inch MacBook Pro. I know for a fact you will consistently get over 10 hours with this MacBook Air. It also comes with a 30-watt power adapter, and I like how small it is. Having a thin laptop and a small power adapter makes it very easy to travel with. Now we'll move on to the display. So this has a 13.3-inch screen. So it is a Retina display with 400 nits of brightness. You may notice how thick the bezels are compared to newer MacBooks, but for the average person, the size of the bezels don't mean anything. So this screen might be old to some people, but if you're coming from the old MacBook Air, then you're gonna love the screen. It's such a huge improvement. It took Apple so long to upgrade that MacBook Air into this one. At first, I wanted the brightness to be a little bit more, kind of like my MacBook Pro. But when I thought about it, I almost never use my MacBook Pro at max brightness. 99% of the time, I lower it just a little bit. And that just shows that the max brightness on the MacBook Air is more than enough. So now we'll move on to the keyboard and Touch ID. One of the best things that Apple added was Touch ID. So instead of typing in your password every single time, you can just use your fingerprint to get in like the old iPhones. And besides that, this MacBook has the Magic Keyboard. It doesn't have the old butterfly keyboard that people hated. And the size of the trackpad is also bigger. So even though this MacBook Air is 3 years old, it still has a lot of the same features as the newer MacBooks. So now we'll talk about the price and value. At the time of this video, this M1 MacBook Air is $800. And to me, that's a steal for a MacBook. It did drop from $1,000 to $800. The M3 MacBook Airs are expected to come out in the next few months, but getting this at $800 or even less is a great deal. When Apple came out with these M1 chips, it was such a huge step forward. You can look at the M2 chip or wait for the M3 chip, but going to those are just minor improvements. Going to the M1 chip was the biggest jump they made, and that's why I believe it'll still be an amazing laptop going into 2024. Again, if you guys can leave a like and consider subscribing, it really helps the channel out. Be sure to watch some of my other Apple videos.